Today I want to answer a question that I've started to wonder about every time I walk up to the cheese counter at the store. Is Parmigiano Reggiano actually worth it? Because when compared to the Parmesan products you can find, it's always the most expensive. So in today's video, we're going to do a deep dive into the world of Parmesan cheese. I purchased 5 different Parmesan products at varying price points, researched into how these are made and regulated before running them through various experiments so we can get to the bottom of this. Because I, just like you, have heard countless confusing things over the years. For example, you may have heard fake Parmesan will clump up and be grainy, so you should always buy the real stuff. Or maybe you have questions like, what do people even mean by real or fake Parmesan? Is the green bottle of pre-grated stuff even made out of cheese? Are Parmesan and Parmigiano Reggiano the same thing? And how do I know if I'm getting Parm Reg from Italy? Or maybe the most important of all, can you actually taste a difference from a US-made Parmesan versus one that is from Italy? Now, I'm someone who has happily spent my money on the $21 per pound for the imported Italian stuff the past couple of years, so this is actually an answer I'm not sure I even want. But I've opened Pandora's box of this fascinating story of the cheese that Italy's Cheese Consortium calls one of the most counterfeited and imitated cheeses in the world. My goal with this video is to arm you with all the knowledge and terms out there so you know exactly what every Parmesan product is offering in order to make a nuanced decision based on your unique situation as a home cook. For example, does it make more sense to blow the budget on DOP Parm and get cheap tomatoes and pasta, or should I get the nice tomatoes and pasta and maybe settle for one of the cheaper US-made Parm options? Now, before we break it down, thank you to Rocket Mortgage for sponsoring today's episode. So while I'm cooking, I almost am always watching a YouTube video on the side. And thank you to today's sponsor, Rocket Mortgage. I have a new series to binge. And no, it's actually not a series of videos where you learn about mortgages. It's a series that does deep dives into fascinating houses, and it's called Home Lore. The most recent episode took a look at a retired kitchen train car that actually fed troops during World War II and has now been converted into a fully functional tiny home. And I love these types of videos looking at interesting living spaces, so if that sounds like you too, head over to the Rocket Learn YouTube channel to check out this video and many other really cool episodes. And thank you again for sponsoring this part of the video. Now, we will get into the candidates and the testing shortly, but I think it makes most sense to actually start this video with how Parmesan-style cheese is made in the first place. Because surprisingly enough, all 5 of these products do use the same main 3 ingredients, which is milk, salt, and cheese cultures. This chart from On Food and Cooking explains how a variety of common cheeses are made, and if we take a look, Parmesan, like a lot of other cheeses, is first coagulated into curds with a rennet, and then that curd is cut and heated to release more whey before being firmly pressed into a wheel, where it is then aged until being broken, and it's used for our sauces, soups, or pastas. Now, that being said, it's really easy to see and taste the differences between these products, especially when they are raw, which again we'll get to shortly. But at a high level, these do generally go through the same process that leaves you with a salty and drier cheese that we all know and love. Now, what if I told you that if these 5 products were being sold in Europe somewhere, that 4 of them would actually be considered counterfeit? And this leads me to a question that I've always had. Is there a difference between something labeled Parmesan versus Parmigiano Reggiano? And after looking into it, to that I would say it kind of depends on where you are. So let's back up and do a brief history on Parmigiano Reggiano and explain the exact specifications that this cheese must go through. According to the Italian Cheese Consortium's website, Parmigiano Reggiano's origins started over 1,000 years ago in the Middle Ages with the same 3 ingredients they use today: milk, salt, and rennet. The cheese was primarily made in the Emilia-Romagna region of Italy, and it got its name from 2 cities in this region, Parma and Reggio Emilia. Now, what's crazy is that as far back as 1612, 160 years before the US was even a thing, the cheese already was starting to be regulated with a deed signed by the Duke of Parma that defined the places where cheese called from Parma could actually come from. As the Parmigiano Reggiano moved into modern times, this designation was expanded, and in 1934, the dairies in the region of Italy agreed they needed a mark of origin for their cheese. And now today, as part of the European Union, if you want a cheese to be considered and stamped as legit Parmigiano Reggiano, there is an extremely specific location and process in which it must be made. Now, all the specification that this cheese must go through in order to be titled Parmigiano Reggiano is actually all summed up in a single document from the official European Union, PDO-IT-02202, titled Parmigiano Reggiano, and last updated November 11th, 2016. Now, I'll link this document below because it's actually just a really interesting read-through because it does have some very specific measures. For example, you have the basic ones like the 3 ingredients that must be used, where it come from, the size of the wheel, and things like that, but then it goes even deeper. For example, there are some notes like the cyclopropane fatty acid ratio has to be less than 22 milligrams per 100 grams of fat, and 75% of the food that the cow itself eats actually has to be produced within the same geographic area, so those cows better not be munching on any grass grown in France. So this outlines exactly what something labeled Parmigiano Reggiano is, but what does it mean if something is labeled Parmesan? And this is where the "it depends" comes in. The word Parmesan is the English translation of Parmigiano Reggiano, and for every country in the European Union, if you see a cheese that is labeled Parmesan at a shop in, say, France or Germany, it is Parmigiano Reggiano, meaning it was made in Italy and upholds all the standards, and this was made in a ruling where it is noted that the term Parmesan is an evocation or extension of Parmigiano Reggiano. And this is where it's kind of interesting to me because say someone made a wheel of cheese exactly how you would make Parmigiano Reggiano, like down to the T. They got it looking the same, they met all the requirements of moisture levels, fat levels, the aging maturity, and all that. But the only thing they changed is that they made it with cows that were from Germany. Now, in this case, even the most discerning Italian may not even be able to tell in a blind taste test, but just because that is so, this cheese still cannot be legally labeled as Parmesan in the European Union. And I was trying to find out some more on this because the EU actually sued Berlin back in 2004 for not upholding the name of Parmesan. And this blog from 2016 also mentions that some French restaurants will use imitation Parmesans, but I want to know what they call them since the words Parmesan or Parmigiano Reggiano cannot be used on the cheese label. Anyway, so why did I give all this background? Well, because in the United States, the words Parmigiano Reggiano are still protected in labeling, but the word Parmesan is not. And this is the exact same thing with how in the US we use the word champagne to generically refer to sparkling wines. But in the European Union, if a bottle is labeled champagne, it must be the specific sparkling wine from the Champagne in France. So while the European Union would consider these 4 to be counterfeit Parmesan, this is perfectly legal labeling in the US, and the FDA actually does have some documentation about things labeled Parmesan, but the restrictions are way, way less. And this brings me to my next question. How can you ensure you are getting the real Parmigiano Reggiano in a US grocery store? Again, the name is protected, so in the United States, it's actually really easy to figure out, especially compared to that canned tomato market. So first, just take a look at the name. If it's labeled Parmigiano Reggiano, it is the legit stuff. If you see it's labeled Parmesan, just assume that it is made with milk or processed in the US. Now the name should be enough, but additionally you can check for the DOP stamp on the cheese packaging, and further, if you buy a hunk with the rind still attached, a last check that you can do is to check the needle stamp that will also say Parmigiano Reggiano. Now there are definitely some pros and cons to kind of the EU versus the US regulation approach. For example, the EU approach would kind of be like saying, In the US, Wisconsin is going to be the only state allowed to produce and label cheddar cheese, even though Vermont and Cabot Creamery may make really great tasting cheddar cheese, they're going to have to label it something else. So very interesting to think about, but it's a whole separate conversation kind of way above me. But what I want to answer in this video is, given the current landscape and options of Parmesan style cheeses in the US, is Parmigiano Reggiano actually worth it? So to do this, we still need to explain some terms and actually how cheese in general works. But let's just hop into the first of 3 taste tests and welcome in the candidates that I chose. First, we have 2 pre-graded options. These are 1, the classic green bottle, and then secondly, a higher end 16-month pre-graded version before moving into the whole wedges. For these, I have a 12-month aged US domestic, a 20-month aged US domestic, and lastly, a whole block of the 24-month Parmigiano Reggiano from Italy. And up to now, we've touched on the history, regulation, and common labeling semantics, but none of that information really helps us answer the original question. So let's start putting stuff to actual practice. And this is where I think it gets fun, because there are 3 important areas to consider and have in mind as we go through these taste tests. Number 1, flavor. Does Parmigiano Reggiano have a significantly better flavor compared to the Parmesan alternatives? And then secondly is food properties. Does it have advantageous food properties such as a higher fat content? Does it melt better? Or do those additives in the US made parms make any difference? And then lastly is lifestyle consideration. How is it going to be used? For example, the recommendation may change depending on what we are using it for, such as a shaved garnish for a salad or sprinkling over some pizza, or if we're going to end up using it in some pasta sauce like an Alfredo or carbonara. And for me, I chose 3 tests that you also can easily replicate at home, and I would recommend trying it because they're just pretty fun. But with that being said, let's hop into taste test number 1. So for this raw taste test, all I did was grate the blocks of Parmesan that I had, and then also spooned out some of those pre-graded ones, blindfolded myself, and had Gabe give me a small spoonful of each one. And spoiler, it's pretty easy to tell the differences here. Man, that one was good, really good. Nice and creamy, kind of really melted on the tongue. Also very good, but also melted on the tongue. That one a little bit drier and a little bit more intense. Okay. Wow, that one is super powdery, which I'm guessing that's got to be one of the pre-graded ones. Like there's no way. It's definitely one of the pre-graded ones. It didn't melt like on my tongue like easily. It definitely like kind of coated everywhere. It was like super powdery. Feels like they forced you like Parmesan flavor in it almost. That one's definitely, like, again, melts on the tongue, very, very close to the second one that I tasted. So the first one I tasted, that one was much more mellow. The second, and now this is the 4th one, those are very similar in flavor. This one, I'm gonna assume it's the higher end graded one. So pebbled up in my mouth, and it didn't melt like the number 1, 2, and 4. Those ones like melted like in my mouth, whereas 3 and now 5, like I definitely noticed kind of like little pebbly bits. DOP, and then, yeah. So this was a super interesting test, and it was really obvious, like picking up on the differences, just blindfolded and using your senses. These 3 absolutely just melted in my mouth. I could 100% tell that these were not the pre-graded ones, because this one was super powdery. This one was like not as powdery, but like it definitely kind of lingered, like the little pieces lingered in my mouth. And then I could definitely taste the flavor differences too, where the 12-month was much more mellow as opposed to, the 20-month US and the 24-month DOP. And then this one was kind of more flavor again, like in between these 2, like as you would expect, it's aged in between them. And then this one has its like signature kind of flavor that but really what I'm interested in now is, why did these not disintegrate in my mouth like these ones did? So after this test, you may be wondering, why does the aged Parmesans taste so much better than the younger ones? And secondly, why did the pre-graded versions kind of linger on my tongue and give a weird texture? And to begin to understand and evaluate these things, we need to go through the 4 main variables that differentiate in how the US and Italy makes their Parmesan cheese. These 4 variables are 1, the aging time, 2, pasteurized milk versus raw milk, 3, additives versus 0 additives, and then 4, the geography, cow's diet, and cheese making process. And when broken down into a US versus EU parm table, it begins to show the differences in the actual makeup of these cheeses. And I want to start with aging first because I think this is the most important decision you'll have to make as a home cook navigating the grocery store, because when it comes to cheese in general, aging has a massive effect on both the taste and texture of the final product. So the official Italian Parmigiano Reggiano must be aged for at least 12 months. And keep in mind that that's after almost the month-long brining process that gives the parm wheels that beautiful hard rind, which you actually don't find on most domestic versions. Now, while the minimum aging time is just 12 months, it can go all the way up to 24, 36, 40, or even up to 100 months if you wanted. There's actually no maximum maturation time as listed on that official website. And if you are in Italy, you'll be able to find a full range of aged parms really easily, but in a US grocery store, that's not the case. Now, I'm not sure of the exact numbers here, but the most common imported Parmigiano Reggiano is going to be the 24-month aged one. There's likely some cost-benefit analysis done by the stores, unless a particular store happened to order something special. Now, it's a completely different story when it comes to aging times in the United States. Based on this Title 21 from the FDA, last updated in 1993, the minimum aging time for something labeled Parmesan is 10 months. And most of the US-made Parmesans I found at the store were 10 or 12 months, but you can find some US-made brands that will age their cheeses for 20 or 24 months, but anecdotally, they're a little bit hard to find. It took me like 4 or 5 grocery stores before I actually got my hands on one. And in general, if you have tried any aged cheeses, you know that they're drastically different than the minimum age counterpart. For example, a young cheddar versus an aged one, a 10-month parm versus a 24-month parm is going to be very, very different. And at a high level, 2 things happen when cheese is aging. 1, cheese cultures continue to transform lactose into lactic acid, and then secondly, the cheese will begin to lose more moisture. And both of these processes intensify the flavor of the cheese and also change the texture, which you can easily see with your eyes. And in general, the younger aged cheese is going to be the mildest in flavor, but it's also going to have a higher moisture percentage and a lower melting temperature when compared to the longer aged Parmesan cheeses. And I'm staying pretty surface level here. There's a lot more science that goes into cheese making and the aging of cheese in general, but let's move on to variable number 2, and that is the milk. Because I bet a cheesemaker would tell me right now that it doesn't matter how long you are aging your cheese in the first place if you are starting with bad milk. And when it comes to the milk used in the Italian Parmesan cheese, that is always going to be raw milk. So in general, the United States is very conservative when it comes to food safety. So for any mass-produced dairy products, US dairy farms are typically going to pasteurize their milk by heating it to a specific temperature for a set amount of time. And this process kills off harmful bacteria that could potentially cause disease, which is a good thing. But the only bad thing about this is that all bacteria is not bad for you or will cause disease. And this process also kills off the bacteria that is partly responsible for developing flavor in the aging and lactic acid fermentation process. Now, in Italy, on the other hand, it is mandated that Parmigiano Reggiano is a hard cheese made from raw cow's milk, meaning the milk cannot be pasteurized beforehand. And the small, highly regulated Italian operations can keep a close eye on the cheese to make sure that any harmful bacteria are not ending up in the final product. Now, if you've ever tasted raw milk, you know that it tastes way different from the stuff that you get at the store. But that being said, it is kind of hard to quantify exactly how much of a difference this makes, because if you try the 24 versus the 20-month aged ones, like, yeah, they taste different, but both are still pretty good. So it's kind of hard to say exactly which thing makes the most difference. And with that being said, let's move on to variable number 3, and that is the additives. By definition, Parmigiano Reggiano can only contain the 3 ingredients we talked about earlier. US cheese companies, on the other hand, might mix in preservatives or enzymes to ensure that their product is safe for mass production, make sure it passes FDA regulation, or has a long enough shelf life to be profitable at the grocery store. And on a US-made Parmesan, there are about 4 potential ingredients that you could see added to the ingredient list. This is 1, cellulose, 2, potassium sorbate, 3, natamycin, and 4thly is enzymes. Now these are all food-grade additives, passed by the USDA, and they're in a variety of products, but really the question is, do these additives significantly affect the taste and texture? And short one, yeah, they do. When I added 30 grams of each of the grated Parmesans to a 275-degree pan, every single one of them melted, with the exception of the green bottle. It kind of just browned and got brittle. It never really melted at all, and this is just kind of weird, which may lead you to wonder, why is this Parmesan cheese from the bottle not melting? And I actually think this is due to a variety of factors. Number 1, a lack of moisture. Number 2, a lack of fat. Number 3, a tight protein structure of the cheese before being grated. And these might partially be caused by 1, adding cellulose powder, and 2, adding potassium sorbate. So let's talk about these. Cellulose powder is a common anti-caking agent that is typically added to grated, shredded, or shaved parms to keep them from clumping up, and it does a good job. Now this alone won't stop cheese from melting because the other pre-grated parm has cellulose powder added as well, but it melted just fine when I added the 30 grams of it to the pan. But I do suspect that this is what caused the green bottle and the pre-grated parm to kind of linger on my tongue in the raw taste test because cellulose is insoluble in water. Next, we have potassium sorbate and natamycin, which are both common food additives that prevent the growth of molds and yeast and generally are going to extend the shelf life and protect the flavor of the cheese. And then lastly, we have the general enzymes, and I'm not actually entirely sure what this is. I tried to look in a little bit deeper, so I could use some help here. But in general, most US-made parms will list both cheese cultures and enzymes on the ingredient list. And I assume that cheese cultures is referring to the rennet that is used to make the cheese, but enzyme also seems to be a generic term used when describing rennet as well. So maybe there are some additional enzymes that are added to the Parmesan cheese process, maybe to make up for the fact that it is pasteurized milk that potentially has lost some of those good flavor-making bacteria. But if anyone knows for sure, just let us know down in the comments. And in general, after reading into these, a lot of articles or videos may tell you to steer clear of the cellulose powder or anti-caking agents if you want to get a smooth and creamy sauce. But as I discovered in the Alfredo test, while not perfectly smooth, it can definitely still be done, and it comes down to the technique used to actually make the sauce in the first place. And we're gonna get to that Alfredo test in just 1 second, but lastly, let's go through the 4th main variable, which is kind of a catch-all for a variety of things. So the geography, cow's diet, and cheese processing likely make a difference, but it is hard to objectively quantify exactly how much of a difference. For example, the geography and land of Reggio Emilia plays a role in the cow's diet since 75% of the dry matter they eat must be from the region. And additionally, silage, which is a fermented preserved grass that is commonly used in the US for cows, is completely banned in Italy. Then lastly, they've been making Parmigiano in Italy for over 1,000 years at this point. So if there's anyone who has the process dialed down and regulated to ensure that the best possible Parmesan cheese is coming out every single time, it's gonna be them. And it's fair to point out that the US market is probably worse for the consumer since there is less regulation around processing and labeling, which can lead to a lot more confusion. For example, they can boast flavor characteristics on the front, you can add marketing terms, it can be sold in a variety of form factors, or they can use any of those additives we just talked about, so it's much harder to compare brand to brand in the US made versions. Now, if I was in the European Union making this video, it'd probably be much simpler. We'd go over a quick summary of that 1-page document I served earlier, and then we'd just go into the differences between the aged Parmigiano Reggianos. Like 12, 24, 36, and all the way up to see if there's kind of a point of diminishing returns. But anyway, this is the current landscape that we're working in and kind of why I decided to make this video. So with that being said, I still want to know, what are these actual differences? We could see what they tasted like raw, but what about used in a sauce? Am I still able to pick up on this up? What about used for a garnish in pizza or pasta? So with that being said, let's start with taste test number 2, and that is the traditional Alfredo test. For this test, I did the traditional 3-ingredient fettuccine al burro. So I made the cheese sauce with 25 grams of butter, 60 grams of each Parmesan product, and starchy pasta water. To make each, I added the butter over medium heat along with the pasta water and emulsified those together. Once mixed, I turned the heat down to low, and very important, you need to keep the temperature below 160 degrees Fahrenheit or else that cheese will seize up and get stringy as you add it. And like I mentioned earlier, the younger aged Parmesan cheeses are gonna have a slightly lower melting point due to having more moisture and a looser protein structure. So for these, I actually had to turn it down to 150 degrees Fahrenheit just to be on the safe side. And I've outlined the food science behind all this stuff in a cacio e pepe video I did a few months back, and that was really the only way I was successfully able to make each of these 3-ingredient sauces with the 5 Parmesan products. Now, once the sauces were made, I mixed them with fresh cooked hot fettuccine to sauce them together. Then I blindfolded myself and had them mix up, so I did not know which is which, and I'll tell you right now, I had a tough time with this taste test comparison. Put the Alfredo behind the container, yeah. All right, so we'll start left, and this one's right, okay. All right, that one was solid. I would say not too strong tasting of Parm, but I mean, solid. I feel like the texture on that one was really nice. Oh, they're both good. I would say that one was a little bit stronger tasting, but it also has got a little bit of a weird aftertaste. Man, I'm getting these like all confused up. And that one's pretty good too. All right, these are way harder than I thought they would be to differentiate from. I don't know if it's good or bad, but definitely stronger tasting. This one is 3. That one a little bit more mellow. I don't know if there's one where I would say clearly it's terrible, and I don't know if there's one where I'd be like, this is the best thing ever, though 3 and 5 were definitely stronger tasting in my opinion. I don't know, I'm just gonna see. I'm really curious. I honestly have no idea. Wow, that was super interesting, dude. So like, that's what I said, like these were very strong tasting, but like I didn't know if they were better, but like I'm lost. Like I'm absolutely lost on all these. I don't even know what to think. Very interesting. Do you guys want to try these? Like I'm like actually like kind of baffled. Like I had no idea, like absolutely no idea. So after seeing these clips, you might have some questions, so we're gonna go through them. First, can I make a sauce with all 5 Parmesan products? The answer to that is yes. But are there differences in how they distribute throughout the sauce? And this is also a yes. So the green bottle is noticeably grainy since, like we showed earlier, it doesn't really melt. And additionally, the younger aged Parmesans have a slightly lower melting point, so they are more prone to melt together, resulting in that stringy sauce, but only if your liquid is too hot. And again, that goes back to the technique, because I can make a stringy cheese sauce with real Italian Parmigiano Reggiano if I want to. But anyway, the third question is where we run into issues. So is there a noticeable flavor difference in the sauces? And surprisingly, not really. It was honestly super hard to tell the differences between them once the cheese was dispersed among the butter, pasta water, and pasta itself. And the only clear marker that I said was the 2 pre-grated options tasted stronger. And I didn't articulate this well in the taste test, but I didn't say they tasted better or more flavorful, because what I meant by stronger is that they tasted saltier, which makes sense because on the nutrition label, the green bottle has double the amount of sodium per a 10-gram serving when compared to the other options. Now fourth, this may make you wonder, so if it was hard to tell the difference between the Alfredo sauces, does this mean that maybe I should not be buying Parmigiano Reggiano for Alfredo sauce? And to this, I would say no. Think about it. If you make a sauce with 1 part butter and 2 parts cheese of any kind, it's probably gonna taste fairly good. But I think the main reason why I had such a tough time differentiating between these 5 was because I didn't add any garnishes to the pasta themselves. Now, I did this completely on purpose because I wanted to taste the sauces on the merits of these sauces themselves. I didn't want to be influenced by a fresh raw grading of any of the parms over the top because, again, I did that test prior alone, and then secondly, the third test is all about the garnishes. So let's dive into those. So for my last taste test, I did 2 garnish tests for both pasta and pizza. And for the pasta, I tried to balance out the sodium levels. So I made 1 mother batch of red pasta by adding some sauce to a pan, tossing in a little bit of cream, and then adding cooked penne so those could get to know each other before portioning them out into 5 dishes. And next, I added the parm in varying amounts before mixing them up and doing the whole blindfold thing, and here are some of my thoughts. Okay, so that one, pretty good, and obviously I can tell, yes, it's the one of them that I graded. That is the advantage of being able to use a block. You can get that kind of micro-graded form. That one, pretty solid. I'd say maybe a little bit mellower than number 1. All right, this one's definitely stronger than number 2. Number 3, noticeably stronger than number 2. That one kind of just like tastes generic to me. Not bad, but just kind of meh. That one is okay. That one might be the green bottle if I had to guess. It kind of had like that green bottle taste. Number 3, I would say it was definitely the strongest and probably my favorite of the 2. I think mellow, strong, stronger, and then this 4 tasted kind of generic, 5 tasted, I think that one might be the green bottle one, but let's just give it a see. We have the 20-month, the 12-month, the DOP, the pre-graded, and then the green bottle, which, yeah, makes sense. And as you could guess, this garnish test definitely fell much more in line with the raw taste test that we did firsthand. Now, secondly, I did want to do 1 more garnish, mainly because I was just in the mood for some pizza. So for this test, I bought 1 massive slice and cut it into roughly equal sized bites, and then added each of the 5 Parmesans, and again, the DOP definitely shine, but to be fair, the 20-month aged US Parm was also quite good. Number 1. That was pretty good. No, that was fine. That was pretty good. That one was pretty strong tasting too, I feel like. Definitely a sharper flavor. A little bit sharper than number 1, I would say. This one also felt like pretty strong tasting. 2 and 3 felt stronger tasting than number 1. I feel like these middle 3 honestly like all just tasted really good to me. Maybe number 1 was like a little bit milder. This one kind of just tasted like pizza. I didn't really, parm wasn't too strong on number 5. So I think 1 and 5 for me were a little bit milder in taste. I think 2 and 3 were my favorite, and then 4 was probably like a step below 2 and 3. So again, another raw taste test, and again, the DOP, the 20-month, the longer aged ones definitely are more concentrated and sharper in flavor, and it really does come through, especially in these raw applications. But again, all of these were still delicious in their own right, and really that leads me to the final questions. How exactly should we shop for Parmigiano Reggiano? Okay, we finally made it. So in conclusion, is Parmigiano Reggiano actually worth it? And in short, yes, I definitely think it is. After running through all these tests, I will continue to pretty much exclusively be buying Parmigiano Reggiano for all of my Parmesan needs, but I will say that I definitely have a new appreciation and understanding for some of the US made products. For example, that 20-month Parmesan was actually quite good. And additionally, I have some real life examples of when you may want to use some of these other products. For one, I'm not gonna throw the green bottle away. I'm just gonna keep it in my fridge as a safeguard since it has a ridiculously long shelf life, and just use it sparingly for things like throwing it on popcorn, a slice of pizza, or maybe just adding it as a salt source to a one-pot pasta. So when might it make sense to purchase a 10-month Parmesan block or something like this higher-end aged grated Parmesan? Well, I think I've got one. So say you are making an Alfredo or carbonara for a large number of people. Maybe it's a family, you've got some friends coming over. What I would recommend, if you want to save some money, is maybe picking up one of these two for the actual sauce, and then getting just a really small block of the DOB Parm that you can use solely as a garnish to put over kind of your US Parm sauce. And I don't know who you got coming over, but I highly doubt that anyone is gonna be able to pick up on the fact that you didn't use an Italian-made Parmesan in the cheese sauce. That being said, here are my final tips when it comes to buying Parmesan cheese at the grocery store. One, if it's labeled Parmigiano Reggiano, it is the real deal from Italy, and it's most commonly gonna be the 24-month age variety. Now, if the cheese is labeled Parmesan, that means it's likely from the US. And in that case, I would, one, recommend getting a whole wedge or a block, as this will give you the most variety and control over the form factor. For example, I wouldn't really recommend buying the shreds or shavings if you're making a cheese sauce, as they will increase the likelihood of the cheese getting stringy because they don't disperse well in the sauce compared to a finely grated Parm. Secondly, take a look at the label to see how long it has been aged. Choose something aged at least 20 months for the best flavor, especially when using them for raw garnishes. Anyway, I hope you now know everything and more than you could possibly want to know about Parmesan cheese. I know I learned a lot. I purchased probably like $150 worth of Parmesan products for this video. So hopefully you guys have enjoyed. It was a lot of fun to make. If you have more ingredients or breakdowns that you want me to make in the style of this video, let me know down below. Let me know down below. It's been a long day. But that is going to wrap it up for me in this one. I will catch you all in the next one. Peace, y'all.